grateful to have Elaine with us today, bringing her amazing cello music. I had an opportunity to speak with her last week, and she asked me about the topic of my message today so she could support it with the music. And I said, I told her that we're doing this month-long tribute to Paramahansa Yogananda, celebrating the 100th anniversary of his arrival in America in 1920. And I told her this week, I'm going to focus on his main message, which was completely radical, audacious, delightful, and liberating, which got her attention. And that message is Yogananda's assertion, you can know God. So that's my topic for today. And somewhere around 15 or 17 minutes, I'm going to try to share with you how it was that he taught you can know God. And of course, it's a radical proposition because many in the West and many worldwide really were and still are accustomed to believing that God is a separate divine being, far removed from our ability to access or to know. So to assert that we can actually know God, that we can realize God, that we can have an intimate relationship with the infinite is radical, it's bold, it's audacious, and it's also delightful, and it's a liberating claim because it means it's possible for us. And this is a claim that exists right in the heart of the teachings of Kriya Yoga that Paramahansa Yogananda came to the West to offer. Now, there were and still are several obstacles to such a teaching. I could give a long list, but I'm going to list a few, and a few, of course, that he addressed. And first, top of the list is the belief that God is only an unknowable mystery. And how could we possibly know something that is beyond our limited comprehension? That's a good question, and he addressed it. And then there's the idea or the belief that God is far removed from us, separate from us, and sometimes that's connected to the idea that we're sinners, that we're fallen from God's grace. And so, the idea that we think of God as perfect, and we're pretty familiar with our own imperfections. And so there's a thought that it totally lacks humility to say that we could know God. And then another one of the obstacles is that, anybody looking can see that the world's religions have different views of God. So which one would we know? And how would we know that that one was indeed the Lord, was God? So I had an interesting introduction to that mindset in a conversation I had many decades ago with my father-in-law, Al. Now, Al was, raised in a traditional Jewish family, and that religion was what he practiced his whole life. That's really all he knew. And then he met me, and he was trying to figure out, well, who is this woman who's a minister, who's teaching, awakening to the one truth known by many names? Who is she, and what does she believe? So he asked me, he said to me, do you pray? I said, yes, I pray. And he said, well, what God do you pray to? And I said, Al, the same one you do. And he said, but you're not Jewish. And so I realized that he had not had that same concept of the universal reality that is called by many names. Now, there are many other theological conundrums that I could mention, but I want to just point to the greatest obstacle that Yogananda noted, that is really by and large, people are not interested in God. Well, that holds true greatly today, more than ever. Why aren't people interested in God? Because in general, even if people believe in some supreme person or spirit or cosmic deity, it's too far removed from our ordinary life. It just doesn't seem relevant for the struggles that people are facing. Yogananda asserted that believing in God doesn't change much for us, meaning that what we think about God or believe about God doesn't impact our daily life in a practical way. So there you have it. He said, and this is a quote from his little book, The Science of Religion. He said, whatever conception of God we form by the exercise of reason, such as he is transcendent or he is immanent, will always remain vague and indistinct unless really felt as such. In fact, we keep God at a safe distance, conceiving him sometimes as a mere personal being, and then again, theoretically, thinking of him as being within us. It is because of this vagueness in our idea and experience concerning God that we're not able to grasp the real necessity for God and the pragmatic value of religion. This colorless theory or idea fails to bring conviction to us. It does not change our lives, influence our conduct in an appreciable way, or make us try to know God. Then he asked, what is the use of a God who remains unknown and whose presence is not inwardly manifest to us, at least in some circumstances in our lives? What's the point? What's the use? So he set out boldly to break through those obstacles, to break through that thinking, and to assert that knowing God was not only possible for us, but it is actually the most practical thing that we can do. And I would say, of course, that this is no less true for us today, and perhaps it is even more true given our current circumstances of such great urgency and importance. So let's bring it home, his message, his challenge, that it's possible to know God, and ask ourselves, where do we stand on that assertion? Do we believe it? Is knowing God possible? Is it practical? Does it interest us? And is that interest that we may have vague, or is it demonstrated by the way that we live? Now, Yogananda, of course, could make a case for our ability to know God because he had both tremendous mind and intellectual understanding of Vedic philosophy about the nature of reality and the existence of God. And beyond that, he had his own direct experience or knowing of that reality. He knew it was possible because he experienced it. So in his first talk in America on October 6, 1920, at the Congress of Religious Liberals in Boston, that talk was titled The Science of Religion, the book that I quoted from this morning. And when you read it, you see that it was really a stirring call to wake the soul of America and to open the door for us to realize God as the fulfillment that we're looking for. He had a very strong belief in America. He was very moved by the American spirit. And what he saw was America's potential for becoming not only a strong material power in the world, but a spiritual power. like a sister to India. That was in his vision. But this was the key. This was the crux point. We had to come to know God. Otherwise, our interest in power and materialism would drag us down. And with spiritual awakening, of course, we could face those difficulties of materialism, militarization, hunger for power, racism, all the things that haunt powerful nations. So his vision was we would take the high road and become a shining light in the world. So 100 years later, we have to ask ourselves, how are we doing? And even in the midst of our turmoil today, I think there's a good case for hope. And I couldn't think of anything more important than us to shine this light of this vision that he carried for us of our ability to wake up spiritually and be a shining example. So Yogananda, in his treatise, of course, knocks down those intellectual assertions that were problematical in terms of proof of God's existence, by looking at, as human beings, we have the capacity to imagine or envision that which is beyond our limited capacity. And even that capacity is itself evidence of the infinite, that we have this ability to extrapolate from the particular to the universal. And we can, of course, observe a higher intelligence in nature running the universe, a supreme intelligence. And we experience within us a moral sense, a conscience, which prods us to a higher standard that holds us accountable. And that, of course, could be called God. And then, that issue about God and religion is, if we see God as omnipresent and omnipotent, which is a common assertion of all religions, then we have to admit that there can be only one. If it's omnipresent, there's only one that is omnipresent, only one reality, not two. So that leads to the rational conclusion that there is one religion, which he said, which is then expressed as many denominations, but they are all worshiping the same reality in different ways, in different forms, with different names, but one reality. And then he clarifies that all these assertions, though they point to a higher power, are all formed by our intellect through inference. They're products of logic. They're thinking about God. But he stressed, thinking about God is not knowing God. It's knowing about God, which is really a good stepping off point, but it's not the point. So how do we know God? So he offered a step-by-step analysis of human nature and invited us to explore this for ourselves, to study ourselves, to look at what we want and what drives us, what's behind every desire that we have. And what he said was, we all naturally want to avoid pain and suffering, and we all want happiness. And when we really examine that in simple and big ways, wanting that happiness, what we discover is we don't want happiness that is here today and gone tomorrow. We want happiness that lasts. We want to be free from pain and sorrow, and we want to know happiness that will not disappoint, that is unconditional. And that happiness, he pinpointed, he said, that is bliss. The unconditional happiness that we are looking for is bliss. And that is the nature of God. Unchanging, unconditional joy. Find that bliss and you will find God. And we know it when we experience it. So here is the difference between intellectual thinking about God and experiencing it through our own intuition, knowing it is so because we experience it. No one has to tell us. It is there in our very being. And how do we know? An ineffable peace pervades our heart and our mind. We know we're whole, we're free. And even if it's just momentary, a momentary cessation of that churning of desire, of looking for something to make us happy or whole or secure, in that moment of divine bliss, we are perfectly content. We have come home. Bliss, the perfect joy of self-knowing, is our introduction to God. The door of the heart opens from the inside, and we're home. Then God becomes our constant companion, our support, our strength, and our joy. And nothing is more practical than that.